Okay, so now we're ready to prep and install the AIO. Now, a few points to make on an AIO. They're all a little bit different and they're all a little bit similar. You're going to get some different hardware that comes with your AIO. Generally, you're going to get AMD hardware, newer Intel hardware, and maybe even as far back as 1155 socket. It just really depends. So whatever your CPU is and motherboard, you want to make sure you're getting an an AIO that works with your setup. Do your research and verify. So just so that you can see what comes in a typical AIO box, you're going to have your fan mounting hardware with washers. And I would recommend using the washers because these screw heads are small. I'm using different screws, but I am using washers because the heads are smaller and they will try to sink into the body of the fan. And that can make it hard to remove the fans later. So use the washers. And typically, already installed will be your Intel bracket. This is an Asus style pump, so it's going to have this kind of Intel bracket on it. I removed it already and put my AMD bracket on. And then you'll usually have an Intel backplate. Now, this motherboard already has the AMD backplate on, and it seems to be physically stuck to the motherboard. Some backplates will have 3M strips that you use to stick it on the back of the motherboard, which is really nice so that if you have to remove anything, it doesn't fall off. You don't have to fight with it. And with the Intels, these standoffs are threaded and they slide back and forth a little bit so they can accommodate different different motherboard sockets. I don't know what you would call that. Anyway, I'm not using it. I just wanted to show you what you can expect to have in your box. For the AMD, they made it very simple. I already installed the mounting bracket to the pump. I have these standoffs that I have to install, and then I have thumb screws that I tighten down. Most of the time, you're going to have some kind of positive feedback from your screws that let you know that it's completely tightened. Some have springs, some have just a dead stop. Like the Threadripper has a specific torque wrench that when it clicks, that's it. The idea is you want to get the pressure even across the IHS, the integrated heat spreader, so that you don't have an uneven distribution of your thermal paste. That's one of the common reasons that a computer will overheat. In spite of having an AIO and good fans and all this, the cooling plate is just not making good contact and spreading the thermal paste properly. I won't say you can't get them too tight. It's very difficult to get one mounted too tight because they've taken that into account and they know that the easiest thing is, screw it down till it stops. I mean, we all can identify when something stops, it's done. So that's kind of what you're up for. Now, most AIOs, most coolers will come with pre-installed thermal paste. This one did, but I cleaned it off for a couple of reasons. Number one, I didn't want to get that stuff all over my hands when I was changing out my bracket. And number two, I don't particularly trust the pre-installed thermal paste. I think that it's adequate, but I think you can do better. So I cleaned it off and I'm going to use my own and I'm going to apply it to the CPU in just a moment. And I'm going to talk about thermal paste just very briefly because I don't want to get into debates. The debate is over and settled. I'm just going to show you what I prefer to do. So let's move forward. The first thing that I want to do, because it's been a while since I've built in the case and I have been putting fans in and things, I'm going to go ahead and clean my CPU with some alcohol. And I use 100% pure alcohol. I don't have to worry about it leaving residue behind. It evaporates quickly, but it is extremely flammable. So you need to make sure you let it dry on its own. Okay, so that's done. And while that's drying, I can go ahead and start working on my fans. So this case made it really convenient to do this. There are more and more cases that have this feature, but it's a removable top tray. And on this particular case, the radiator is going to be on the top side. The fans will be on the bottom side. That not only saves space, but it makes it easier to install the AIO as one full unit when the time comes. Now, I recommend wait until you're absolutely ready to install it before you put your thermal paste on your CPU. You don't want dust sticking to it. You don't want any risk of something happening to it. So we have plenty of time to do that. So let's get to the fans. Okay, so now we've got our fans wrap free, and we can proceed. It's like Legos with lights. They're so pretty. Look at that. That's cool. I mean, if you don't think that's cool, then I don't know. I think that's just a cool design. I don't mind. I don't mind being a fanboy. I've typically been a Corsair fanboy, and I'm not ashamed of it. It's just in this particular situation, I went a different direction. Okay. So now you can kind of start to see this take shape a little bit of how this is going to be. Now, obviously, I can't just run my screws up in there because I still have a radiator to deal with. Now, I already went ahead and kind of held everything up and made sure the orientation was going to work out properly. As I've mentioned in other videos, you want to do that. You want to make sure you're familiar with how you're going to position things before you have thermal paste to fight with and all this other stuff. Your hands are about to get really busy in this particular part, so you want to already have a picture of what you're going to be doing. So now I can lay the radiator over this, but now see, I have to think about how am I going to get this to work out for me. Well, here's how. See what I did there? I just flipped it over. I made sure I kept the orientation correct on everything. And I can kind of line up my screw holes. Make sure they're pretty close to where I want them to be. And then I can set my fans in place. Make sure I'm happy with that. Okay. So now another thing that I have to consider is where do I want my wires to go for the fans? So in this particular case, I really don't want my wire to come out the front and then dive off to the side. I have plenty of room to put them toward the back. So your pins, they just need to go in the back. That's another great thing about these fans is they're so modular. You can orient them in so many ways and make them work for your particular need. So earlier I had mentioned using washers with these smaller screws. Well, as I got ready to install one, I realized that because of the thickness of this mounting bracket, uh, along with the washer, made the screws too short. So what I did is I took the washer off and I gave it a test check to make sure that I could tighten it down and it wouldn't be pulling into the body of the fan. These fans are pretty durable. It's going to be more than enough to stop it from doing that. So, that was a surprise that caught me off guard. Look for those kind of things. You'll get little surprises as you're going, and you have to be able to adapt to them. There's no absolute. I didn't say you absolutely must use the washers. I said, yeah, it's a good idea to, and it is a good idea too, and I would have if I could. In any case, we're not going to now. Getting your first screw started is the hardest part. It just takes feeling. You don't want to strip these out. You need to be very careful. The threads are the threads are kind of flimsy. There it goes. They should screw in easily. Again, I'm going to do the opposite corner. That's going to make it a whole lot easier for me to line up the entire group of fans. See that? Now, I can go ahead and drop in my screws. Oftentimes, you'll find a little paint or powder coat has gotten into the threads, and it'll make the screws kind of resist you a little bit. That's why it's important that you make sure it starts fully, because you don't want to cross thread these. We're going to go corner to corner. And we're just snugging them down. So I'm going to go ahead and install my power wire. And I have to kind of think about where am I going to run this wire out to? So, because I'm upside down, I'm going to orient it to this side. And, I don't really like these bread ties. And although I have to fight with the cable, I just go ahead and remove them. And there we go. So now you can see I have just one wire for those fans. If this were a lot of other AIOs, you would have 6 wires for the fans right now if they were RGB wires. So this is a really great feature, and to me, as well as everything else, they're just a hard fan to beat. Okay, so now what remains is to mount the radiator fan support bracket, and then I'm going to lay the case on its back, and I'm going to get ready to install the pump to the motherboard. Now this is where you're going to want to have that mouse pad handy or something else that you can lay on the motherboard and kind of protect it while you not only move the case, but you have a place to rest the pump while you get everything else ready. So I'm going to cut here and then get the camera position so you have a better view of me installing the pump.
That won't be able to really do anything.
Okay, and here we are. We are ready to mount our pump to the processor. Now, as I said, I've already cleaned the processor. I've also cleaned the cold plate on the pump again because I've been moving it around a good bit. So I wanted to show you this standoff that comes with this pump for AMD. If I can get it to focus. Okay, so that's the kind of standoff, and this round part kind of free spins here. And you don't really need a tool to tighten this down. The thumb screws, which are these guys, are going to tighten it down as you screw it in. And, again, the back plate is mounted to the motherboard, so if you were to remove this and for whatever reason you unscrewed the standoff completely out of the bracket, that's okay. It's not going to hurt anything. This isn't a motherboard standoff, so it's not the end of the world. So I just wanted to show you that real quick. Also, we'll put a note on when I did it, but I realized that I grabbed the wrong cable when I connected to the 3 fans on the radiator. I needed to use the cable that has the ARGB and the PWM connectors. So I've already made that correction. When you have a lot of cables laying around, it's really, really easy to do something derpy like that. So just make sure you double check yourself. And as I was rearranging the case, I noticed it and I saw that and, I made the correction. Happens to everybody. All right. So as I mentioned before, there's a lot of debate that goes around about thermal paste, and I'm not going to get into it. There's some videos out there that prove definitively that there are 2 best methods. Now, the worst method is none at all. No one will argue with that. However, some people say a P size, some people say an X or a plus or this or that. Ideally, you want complete coverage, but as long as you've got some on there, it's going to help. But when you're talking about these CPUs that create a lot of heat and do a lot of tasks constantly, you have to logically realize that the more heat it can get rid of, the better it's going to perform. To a point, you can't keep a CPU too cold. Unless you get into liquid nitrogen, you're never going to get a CPU too cold. So the more fans, the more cooling, the better. So thermal paste plays a very large role in that. It helps 2 dissimilar metals have good thermal conductivity, It also helps to fill in the microscopic ridges of those metals so that there's 100% contact to that paste, which conducts thermal energy. I don't like messing with the beryllium liquid, or not beryllium, that would be different, gallium liquid metal paste, because they are electrically conductive. I highly discourage using that, because if you get it in the wrong place, you can see all around the processor there are contact points. I'm not a motherboard engineer. I don't know which ones of these have voltage. I'm not taking a chance. Use a tried and true thermal paste and apply it well. Me personally, I like to use the Thermal Grizzly Hydronaut. You know, it's a very high quality thermal paste. You can get it in a small tube like this, which is enough for many computers, or you can get it in a great big fat tube that I have over on my bench. You know, just make sure that you apply it. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with an X. Or I'm going to start with removing the cap. And then I'm going to apply an X pattern. Now, I got quite a bit on there, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to spread it all across it, because that's the way I like to do it. And it's got kind of like a, I don't know, like a hot bubble gum texture and consistency. I don't know how else to describe it. You do not have to be super meticulous about this. You do not have to go edge to edge and all that, because when you tighten down your pump, it's going to spread it. There's some videos that you can find online where people have tested different amounts of paste and different patterns of applying it. They've even done things like, you know, bubble gum and bacon grease and, you know, all kinds of silly stuff just to see, you know, what happens. And you'd be surprised at the things that will conduct the heat away from the IHS. But everyone really kind of agrees that at the end of the day, just make sure you get enough on there. You know, if it's not pretty, it's not going to hurt anything. If any of this spills over, it's not going to hurt a thing. So, you know, it's a little heavier in the middle, and I kind of tapered it out at the edges because I'm trying to avoid it running over too terribly bad. But that's more than enough. So, I would recommend that you remove your brackets and things before you do this. I wanted to have a really good point of view for applying that. So I decided to go ahead and do it right then. So what I'm doing right now is I'm removing these hook brackets that come standard on AM4 motherboards. There may be some that don't have them. I don't know. As far as I know, they're always there, and they're really not that great because they only have 2 points of tension, and so that makes it really easy to have an uneven distribution of your thermal paste. Fortunately, most of the aftermarket air cooler and AIO makers have, accounted for that, and they give you a bracket that is going to alleviate that. Now, I don't know if you saw that. My back plate just completely fell out. When I loosened these earlier, there was no indication that it wasn't secured. So now what do you do about it? Well, you deal with it. I'm going to show you how right now. So again, see this mouse pad? Very, very handy tool to have. Okay, so off camera what I did is I had to fish the back plate out from between the case and the motherboard, and instead of putting 3M tape to secure it to the motherboard, they've got a Teflon insulator there. Now, that one is new. Maybe that's an AMD thing. This is my first AMD build. I've always done Intel builds. So maybe that's just something different. I don't know. So what I did is I stood the case up, I positioned the back plate, and I got two of the standoffs in place. And now I don't have to worry about it falling back through again. So be aware of that. It could happen to you. Maybe they're getting away from having them stuck to the motherboard. In any case, we'll just keep right on moving along. Now, the reason that, you really probably should not do the thermal paste so soon is it is really easy at this point to get your fingers on it. However, it's also harder to spread it when it gets to this point, and that's the reason why a lot of people have taken to using an X or something else, because it's easy. Well, easy is not always the best. And it might work if you take that computer apart in 2 hours or 3 hours or in a week. But if you're building a computer for years and you're not the kind of person to change your thermal paste every year or any of that, then you need to make sure you're thorough now. It will come in, it will be to your benefit down the line. Again, you can't really have too much unless you just blob it all over the place, but you can have not enough. Okay, so now we're ready to set the pump on, and I'm going to make sure that my hands are clean before I touch it. I keep alcohol and lint-free towels handy. Pure alcohol is not going to hurt anything. It's not going to hurt good gloves. It's not going to hurt any surface on your computer. I can't think of a single one. I've even used it to clean my monitor screen. If I had something bad on it, it's not going to hurt anything. But use it cautiously. So the orientation of the pump is extremely important. You never want your pump to be higher than your radiator's top point. Now, if you did a vertical radiator, you would want the pump to be lower than the high point of the radiator. And the reason for that is you don't want air to get into the pump. If any air should develop in the system, you want it to collect somewhere harmless. And that's why they recommend tubes down and the pump low when you install a vertical radiator. Now, ideally, you want it top mounted like I have it, and then your pump is obviously going to be lower. And also, if any air does develop, it's going to collect at the very top side of the radiator, well away from where the tube inlets are. It's not going to get into the system. So when I go to put the pump on, I'm just going to push it straight down. I'm not going to jiggle it and wiggle it. I'm just going to try my best to line it up all in one shot. All right. And I just looked real quick to make sure all the screws were in the corresponding holes. I'm going to get my thumb screws started. I'm not going to tighten them down yet. You want to kind of keep your hands on this right now because those tubes going across the memory will try to make the pump pop up. Now it's okay. And now is when we can bring in something to help us reach down in there. And this extension comes in really handy for that. Number 2 Phillips bit fits down in here perfectly. Make sure they're magnetic or iron based at least. You know, jiggle them around a little. Some of them are stainless steel. Man, stainless steel's not magnetic. And it fell off anyway. This is probably the most tedious part. And it's a really important part. If there's a most important part of this, it's this. Because these thumb screws have to be tightened down crisscross and as evenly as you can. See, I'm having to lift these hoses up out of my way while I'm trying to twist this. It's very tight in there. Okay, so now what we want to do is we want to work in a crisscross pattern to get this to pull down tight. We don't want to use a power screwdriver. I don't even recommend you put it down in here. Just get a manual screwdriver to do this, because if you accidentally over tweak it, you could probably damage something. So you can see it starts to move a little bit as I tighten it down, and that's what I'm watching. That's when I stop and I go to the other side. So when they start to snug up, make sure that they're about as even as you can all the way around, and you're just going to screw them until they stop. You don't need to press down and put monkeys on it. See how the screwdriver's slipping out? That's kind of one way I know that it's tight enough. And I'm really not pressing down with any force at all. I'm just letting the screwdriver do the work. You would have to try really hard to do this wrong. Okay, so for this particular AIO, it has a removable LCD screen. Some of them, it's an all-in-one kind of deal that you can't remove. Some don't have a screen at all. They're just a pump head that maybe has a light or something. And at this point, you would be done with installing your AIO. So for mine, I'm going to go ahead and put my screen on because I don't want it getting bounced around all over the place. And, you know, I have some things I need to consider in terms of how I run my wires. And so this will help me get a better look at it. So essentially, this AIO has magnetic pegs that align it and help secure it. And it's a very, very clever system that they came up with. Did you hear it click? That's it. And so again, this AIO is really nice. It has a downforce fan that's going to help keep the VRMs cool. It's going to help keep the RAM cool. And actual testing has shown that it's effective. It's not a gimmick, and it's not loud. That's a beautiful thing about it. The fan is not loud. So other than peeling off the screen protector, that's done. So what we've accomplished is installing our case fans and our AIO. So it's time for a recap. Okay, and that completes installing fans and an AIO in the Hyte Y60. Okay, now there's a few things I want to point out about this particular AIO that I saw online. It seems that some people have been taking the USB 2.0 plug and actually connecting it to the AIO pump header on the motherboard. That's completely wrong. That means you did not read the manual. I can't stress enough how important it is to read the manual and not make assumptions about products. Every component maker is trying to do things a little better or a little different than their competitor, and that can be a challenge for the builder. For example, this AIO does not have a plug that connects to the CPU fan header. What does that mean? Well, normally there's a warning that will come on that says, hey, there's no fan connected for the CPU, and it'll shut your computer right down. You could use a jumper to bypass that. Most of the time, we would use another fan to remedy that problem. On some BIOS, you can actually turn off that warning. I don't recommend you do that. So what solution did I come up with? Well, I realized I got 2 single pack fans from Lian Li. So that means I had a second wire that had the PWM and ARGB plug. So my exhaust fan, I'm going to connect it to the CPU fan header. That way, as the temperature on the CPU changes and the pump speeds up, it's going to also control that rear exhaust fan. Because if the CPU is getting warmer, most likely the air in the case could be getting warmer and I need to get it out quicker. So that's a logical way to solve that problem. I highly discourage you from bypassing that warning. That's really only good in cases like if you're troubleshooting, if you're having some kind of a problem, you're trying to isolate the issue, you can shut it off temporarily then, but make sure you turn that back on, or you will likely end up frying a CPU. You'll forget it, and it'll just happen. Another thing too, just like you saw, some things caught me by surprise, even though I had planned for them. That's going to happen. Be flexible. Do not expect to win every round as you build a computer, especially if you have to go days or weeks in between different steps. That's kind of been a downside for me on this series, but I'm doing this for you so that you have something to reference that's real. It's not cut out. It's not fast forwarded. This was a long video, and this should be the last long video of this series because the rest are kind of going to have a natural flow to them, and they're going to be a lot easier to keep short, and they're just easier parts of the build. The major parts are done. If you've kept up this far, congratulations. You've almost got a working computer. Now it's time to start doing things like the cabling, power wires, and any accessory things that you're going to put in the computer, like additional drives and things like that. I've got some interesting things I'm going to add to the computer. I've got one that you've probably seen it in other places regarding this case, and I'm going to do it as well because I think it's awesome. No spoiler, you're going to have to wait and see. But I'm really looking forward to the next episodes. Now, I don't know what I'm going to do for the next episode. If you're watching this video and you're following along, give me an idea of what you'd like to see me do for the next episode because it's kind of open. I can go ahead and do power wires and some cabling. I could do some accessories and other add-ons. I can do those in any order at this point. So tell me what you'd like to see. Anyway, thank you very much for sticking with me through these long videos. I hope that they've been educational and informative. Give me a thumbs up if you really like them. And also, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and sharing the channel because it really does help me out. and click that notification bell so you know when the next video drops. As always, thank you for joining me in Gibby's World of Tech.